They told him Apache women were dangerous, but nothing prepared Ethan Cole for the night one stepped out of a blizzard, shut his cabin door, and said, "If you sleep alone tonight, you won't see morning." The wind outside howled like it had teeth, rattling the wooden walls of his cabin buried under 3 feet of snow, 40 miles from the nearest town and a world away from mercy, and Ethan stood there, boots planted, hand hovering near his revolver, studying the woman who had just walked into his life like a storm that knew his name. She was tall, steady despite the cold, dark-haired, dusted with frost, eyes sharp and unreadable, not pleading, not afraid, just certain, and that certainty unsettled him more than the knife resting loosely in her hand, not raised, not threatening, just present, like a truth he hadn't asked to hear. "You picked the wrong cabin," Ethan said, voice low, measured, the kind of voice a man learns when silence has been his only company for too many winters. But she didn't move, didn't blink, just stepped closer to the dying fire and glanced at the weak flames like they were already gone. "Fire won't last," she said, her English steady, edged with something older than his understanding, and cold doesn't wait for permission. And for a moment, Ethan almost laughed, because he knew cold, knew how it crept into your bones, slowed your breath, made a man forget why he was fighting at all, but something in the way she said it made it feel like a warning meant for him, not herself. "You here to threaten me, or save yourself?" he asked, finally pulling his hand away from the gun, because she hadn't given him a reason to use it, and she tilted her head just slightly, like he'd missed the point entirely. "Both," she said, and then, quieter, "because out here, they're the same thing." The words hanging in the air between them like frost, and Ethan felt it then. That shift, that moment when a night stops being ordinary and starts becoming something you'll carry for the rest of your life, whether you want to or not. She moved past him without asking, setting her knife down on the rough wooden table, not as surrender, but as a decision, then glanced toward the narrow bed against the wall, the only real place in the cabin where warmth might survive until dawn. "We share heat," she said simply, not looking at him now, just stating a fact the way people do when the world doesn't care about your pride, or we both lose it. And Ethan swallowed, eyes flicking to the storm clawing at his windows, then back to her, to the distance she kept, to the way she didn't try to come closer, didn't try to persuade, just stood there like the choice was his and the consequences belonged to nature. "And if I say no?" he asked, testing her, testing himself, and she met his gaze again, calm, unshaken. "Then I walk out," she said, "and you listen to the wind until it takes you to." And something in that answer, no anger, no fear, just truth, pressed against the walls he'd built around himself for years, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole realized this wasn't about a stranger in his cabin. It was about whether he was still the kind of man who could let someone freeze just to keep his distance. The wind pressed harder against the cabin, slipping through every crack like it was searching for a way in, and Ethan could feel the cold settling deeper into the wood, into the floor, into the space between breaths, while the fire shrank to a weak glow that barely reached the corners of the room. He moved toward it out of habit, nudging a log that no longer had much to give, watching the faint spark struggle before fading again, and behind him, he could hear her steady breathing, not hurried, not desperate, just controlled, as if she had already accepted the terms of the night. "You speak like you have done this before," he said without turning, his voice quieter now, less guarded, and she answered after a moment. "I have watched storms take people who thought they were stronger than weather," her tone calm, almost distant, as though she was remembering something that did not belong to this room, and Ethan nodded slightly, because he had seen the same thing, men who believed they could outlast nature, only to be proven wrong by something they could not fight. He straightened and turned back to her, noticing how she kept her distance, standing near the wall instead of the bed, as if she was waiting for him to decide whether she stayed or stepped back into the storm, and that choice sat heavy in his chest. "You said we share heat," he said. "But you also said that means something where you come from." And her eyes met his again, steady and unflinching. "It means responsibility," she said, "not ownership," the words landing with a weight that surprised him, because they sounded nothing like the stories he had heard, nothing like the warnings people had filled his head with years ago, and for a moment, he realized how much of what he thought he knew had never been tested. The wind outside rose again, rattling the shutters with a force that made the cabin groan, and instinctively, his gaze flicked toward the door, imagining how quickly the cold would swallow everything inside if it gave way. Then back to her, still waiting, still silent. "You could have taken what you needed without asking," he said, glancing briefly at the knife resting on the table, and she shook her head once, a small, certain movement. "Taking is easy," she replied. "Living with it is not." And something about that answer cut deeper than any threat could have, because it echoed a truth he had spent years trying not to hear. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that fogged the air in front of him, and for a second, he saw his own reflection in the frost on the window, a man who had chosen distance over connection, silence over explanation, survival over everything else. And now that choice stood in front of him, asking for something he had not given in a long time. "You do not trust me," he said, more statement than question, and she did not deny it. "No," she answered, "but I trust the cold less." And that, strangely, made him almost smile, not because it was funny, but because it was honest in a way few things were. The fire cracked softly, a final flicker, and Ethan knew it would not last another hour. Maybe less, and the night stretched long beyond that, miles of darkness and frozen air pressing in from every side. He looked at the bed, then back at her, and slowly, deliberately, he stepped away from the fire, creating space, not closing it, his voice steady when he spoke. "No touching," he said, setting the boundary like a line in the snow. "Just survival." And for the first time since she had entered the cabin, something in her expression shifted, not softer, not warmer, but understanding, as if he had finally spoken a language she recognized. She nodded once, accepting the terms without argument, and moved toward the bed with quiet, measured steps, leaving just enough distance between them for choice to still exist. And as Ethan followed, the storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if the world itself was listening to what he would do next. The bed creaked softly under their combined weight, not from closeness but from the quiet negotiation of space, each of them lying on opposite edges, as if an invisible line ran between them. And for a long moment neither spoke, the only sound the wind dragging its cold fingers across the cabin walls and the slow, fading crackle of a fire that had already given everything it could. Ethan kept his eyes on the ceiling, counting his breaths the way a man does when he is trying not to think. But thinking came anyway, creeping in like the cold, and he became aware of her presence in ways he could not ignore. The steady rhythm of her breathing, the faint scent of smoke and sage clinging to her clothes, the quiet strength in the way she held herself even in stillness. "What is your name?" he asked finally, his voice low enough that it barely disturbed the air between them. And there was a pause, not hesitation, but consideration, before she answered. "Naeli," the words settling into the room with a weight that felt older than either of them, and he nodded once, even though she could not see it. "Ethan," he replied, offering his own name like something he had not used in a long time. Silence returned, but it was different now, less sharp, less guarded, as if something small had shifted, and after a while she spoke again, her voice softer, almost blending with the wind. "You have lived alone here for many winters." It was not a question, and Ethan let out a slow breath, watching it fade into the cold air above him. "Long enough," he said, and she turned her head slightly, studying him in the dim light. "People do not choose silence without reason," she said, and he almost smiled at that, because she was right. But he did not answer, not yet. The storm pressed harder against the cabin, a sudden gust making the walls groan, and instinctively, both of them pulled the thin blanket tighter, not toward each other, but against the cold that did not care about their distance. And Ethan felt it then, the undeniable truth of her words. That warmth was not something a man could keep to himself out here, not tonight. "Where I come from," Naeli said after a while, her voice steady again. "Sharing warmth means you are responsible for the life beside you." And Ethan turned his head slightly, enough to see the outline of her face in the dim light. "And if that life is a stranger," he asked, and she met his gaze without hesitation, "then you learn who they are before the night ends." The answer simple, but it carried something deeper, something that pressed against the walls he had built for years. He shifted slightly, not closer, but not as far as before, the space between them narrowing by inches instead of miles. And it was not a decision he made out loud, just one that happened when the cold made its own arguments. His eyes drifted to the amulet resting against her collarbone, catching what little light remained. And something about it stirred a memory he had buried deep, a flicker of a different night. Different voices, a moment of mercy he had never spoken about. And before he could stop himself, he asked, "That necklace, where did you get it?" And for the first time since she had entered the cabin, Naeli's expression changed, not fear, not anger, but recognition, quiet and sharp, as if a piece of the night had just fallen into place. She did not answer right away, just watched him, studying the question behind his question, and outside, the wind shifted again, lower now, heavier, as if the storm itself was listening, waiting to see what truth would come next. The question lingered between them like frost that refused to melt, and for a moment Naeli said nothing, her eyes steady on Ethan as if measuring not just the words he had spoken, but the weight behind them. And then she lifted a hand slowly, touching the small amulet at her neck with a kind of quiet familiarity, her fingers brushing the worn edges of the stone as though it carried more than memory. "It was given to someone who did not belong," she said at last, her voice low, careful. "A man who should not have been trusted, but was." And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, something old and buried, the kind of feeling a man does not name because naming it would make it real again. The wind outside shifted, dropping for a brief second into a heavy silence before rising again, and in that pause, Ethan's mind drifted back whether he wanted it to or not, to a different night, not as cold but just as unforgiving, a place where choices had not come with time to think, only time to act, and he could see it clearly now, the shape of it, the figure of a woman who had looked at him not with fear, but with something else, something that had unsettled him even then. "There was a healer," he said slowly, his voice roughened by memory more than the cold. "Years ago, in a place I was not supposed to be. She wore something like that." He nodded toward the amulet, his gaze fixed on it, as if it might confirm what he was not ready to believe. "She had no reason to help me. But she did." He paused, the words catching for just a moment before he pushed them forward. "And I left before I could understand why." The admission hung there, heavier than anything else he had said that night, and for a second he wondered if he should have kept it to himself. But something about Naeli made silence feel like a worse choice. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, but her hand remained on the amulet, holding it now as if the story had weight she could feel, and when he finished, she drew in a slow breath, the kind that steadies something inside before it shifts. "She told me about him," Naeli said, her voice softer now, but not weaker. "A man who came from the storm and left before the sun. A man who carried guilt heavier than his pack, but chose not to carry cruelty." Ethan closed his eyes briefly at that, because he did not remember it that way. He remembered confusion, fear, a moment where doing nothing would have been easier, and yet he had not done nothing, and now here it was, standing in front of him in a form he could not ignore. "She kept the amulet for many winters," Naeli continued, her gaze steady on him, "until she gave it to me, and said if I ever found the man again, I would know him by the way he looked. At the cold, like it was something he deserved." The words settled over him like the snow outside, quiet but impossible to shake, and Ethan let out a slow breath, turning his head back toward the ceiling because meeting her eyes now felt like standing too close to something he was not ready to face. "You think that was me?" he said after a moment. Not quite a question, not quite denial, and she did not answer right away, just watched him with that same calm certainty she had carried since she walked through his door. "I think you already know," she said finally, and there was no accusation in her voice, no judgment, just a truth placed gently between them, and for a long moment neither moved, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by something far more complicated. Outside, the storm pressed on, relentless and indifferent, but inside the cabin, something had shifted, something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with what came after it. And as Ethan lay there, listening to the wind and the quiet presence beside him, he realized the night was no longer just about making it to morning. It was about whether he could face the man he had been when the light finally came. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, like something had been uncovered that neither of them could put back. And Ethan lay there staring at the ceiling while the weight of her words settled deeper than the cold ever could. Because cold could be fought, endured, survived, but truth had a way of staying. He shifted slightly, the distance between them now measured not in inches but in choices, and for the first time that night, he was aware that he was no longer just sharing space with a stranger. He was sharing it with someone who carried a piece of his past he had never expected to see again. She should not have helped me, he said quietly, more to the darkness than to Nayeli, but she heard him anyway, because her voice came back just as steady. She believed that who you are in a moment matters more than who you were before it. And Ethan let out a breath that felt heavier than it should, because that was not how he had lived. Not for years. He had built his life on the idea that what a man had done stayed with him, that it shaped every step that followed. And yet here was someone telling him that one moment had been enough to change how he was remembered. The wind outside eased for a brief second, not stopping, just shifting, and in that small lull, Ethan became aware of something else, a sound beneath the storm, faint but real, something distant and rhythmic that did not belong to the wind. His brow tightened slightly, his senses sharpening the way they always had when something felt out of place, and without thinking, he lifted his head just a little, listening harder, and Nayeli noticed the change immediately. "You hear it," she said, not asking, and Ethan nodded once, slow, careful. "Not the storm," he replied, his voice dropping lower, more focused, something else, and for a moment neither moved. Both of them listening to the world beyond the cabin walls, where the snow swallowed most sounds but not all. The faint rhythm came again, distant, steady, like something moving with purpose rather than chance, and Ethan felt a familiar tension settle into his chest. Not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that kept a man alive in places where mistakes did not get a second chance. "Riders," he said after a moment, more certain now, and Nayeli's eyes did not widen, did not show surprise, only recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment long before she stepped through his door. "They followed me," she said simply, and Ethan turned his head toward her, studying her in the dim light, searching for something in her expression, but finding only the same calm certainty she had carried all night. "Friends?" he asked, and she shook her head once, not in denial, but in clarification. "They wait," she said. "They do not act until they understand." And that answer did not ease the tension in him. If anything, it sharpened it, because waiting meant watching, and watching meant judgment. The wind rose again, covering the distant sound for a moment, but Ethan knew it was still there, circling, holding position somewhere beyond the reach of the cabin light, and he exhaled. Slowly, his gaze drifting back to the ceiling as he processed what that meant. So this night was never just about the cold, he said, the realization settling into place, and Nayeli did not deny it. "No," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "It was about who you would choose to be when no one was supposed to see." And Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second at that, because he understood now, understood why she had come, why she had asked instead of taken, why she had waited for his answer, instead of forcing her own. And outside, somewhere in the storm, unseen eyes continued to watch, not for weakness, not for strength, but for something far more difficult to prove. The sound outside did not rush closer, did not break into chaos. It simply remained, steady and patient, like something that understood time better than fear. And Ethan lay still for a moment longer before slowly pushing himself up, the old wood of the bed creaking under the shift of his weight as he swung his boots onto the cold floor, the chill biting through even the worn leather. He did not reach for his gun, not yet. Instead, he moved toward the window, each step measured, listening between the gusts of wind for that same rhythm. And it came again, faint but undeniable, hooves pressing into snow with purpose, not wandering, not lost. Behind him, Nayeli did not rise, but her presence sharpened, her breathing steady, her attention fixed not on the storm, but on him. "If they wanted to come in," Ethan said quietly, his hand resting against the frost-lined frame of the window, "they would have already." And Nayeli's voice followed, calm as ever. "They are not here to take," she said. "They are here to see." And that word settled differently, heavier than anything else she had said, because seeing meant judgment, and judgment meant a kind of truth a man could not outrun. Ethan wiped a small circle of frost from the glass with his sleeve, just enough to peer through, but the storm blurred everything beyond a few yards, snow swirling thick and relentless, hiding shapes, hiding distance, hiding whatever waited out there, and yet he felt it, that quiet certainty that he was not alone, that eyes were on. The cabin, not hostile, not welcoming, just watching. How many? He asked without turning, and there was no hesitation in her answer. Enough, she said, and something in the way she spoke told him numbers did not matter, not tonight, not in this moment, because whatever stood outside was not measuring strength the way men usually did. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath fogging the small space he had cleared on the glass before it faded again, and he stepped back from the window, letting the frost reclaim its place, sealing the outside world away once more. He turned toward the room, toward the bed, toward her, and for a second he simply stood there, as if weighing something he could not put into words. You knew they would follow, he said, not accusing, just stating what had become clear, and Nayeli inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it without apology. Yes, she said, but they do not follow me. They follow what I carry. Her hand brushing the amulet again, the small movement enough to draw his attention back to it, to the memory tied to it, to the choice he had made years ago that had somehow led to this night. And what do they expect to see? He asked, his voice quieter now, not guarded, but searching, and Nayeli met his gaze, her expression steady, unwavering. Whether the man she spoke of still exists, she said, and the simplicity of that answer landed harder than any threat could have, because it was not about survival anymore, not about weathering the storm or outlasting the cold. It was about something far more difficult, something that could not be proven with strength or skill. Ethan let the words settle, felt them move through him, touching places he had kept closed for years, and he gave a small nod, not to her, not to the unseen figures outside, but to something inside himself that had been waiting for a moment like this. He turned back toward the bed, lowering himself down again, not retreating, but choosing to stay, to face the night as it was meant to be faced, and as he pulled the thin blanket back over himself, he did not shift away this time, did not rebuild the distance he had held before. He simply lay there, close enough to share warmth without crossing the line he had drawn, and in that small, deliberate choice, something changed, something quiet but undeniable, like the difference between enduring the cold and deciding what kind of man you would be in it, and outside, beyond the walls, beyond the storm. The watchers remained, silent, patient, waiting for dawn to tell them what the night already knew. The night stretched longer than it should have, each minute dragging across the silence like the wind dragging snow across the ground. And Ethan lay still beside Nayeli, no longer counting breaths, no longer measuring distance, just listening. To the storm, to the faint rhythm beyond it, to the quiet presence beside him that no longer felt like a threat, but something else, something harder to define. The cold had not lessened, but it had changed, no longer biting through him the same way, held back by the shared warmth they had chosen without speaking again. And in that stillness, something inside him began to settle, not peace, not yet, but a kind of clarity that only came when there was nothing left to distract a man from himself. You stayed, Nayeli said softly after a long silence, her voice barely above the sound of the wind, and Ethan let out a slow breath, staring into the dim outline of the ceiling. I said I would, he replied, simple, direct, and she shifted slightly, not closer, but enough that he could feel the change, the awareness that she was no longer watching him as she had before, measuring, questioning, but seeing him as something decided. Many would not, she said, and there was no judgment in her tone, only observation, and Ethan almost answered with something dismissive. Something easy, but the words did not come, because he knew she was right, knew how many men would have chosen distance over responsibility, would have let the cold decide instead of making a choice themselves. Outside, the storm began to change, not ending, but softening, the wind losing some of its edge, the snow falling steadier now, quieter, and with it came a shift in the air, a sense that the night was moving towards something, not just continuing. Ethan turned his head slightly, glancing toward the door as if he could see through it, as if he could feel the presence beyond it more clearly now, and the faint rhythm returned, not circling anymore, but holding, steady and still, like a line drawn in the snow. "They are closer," he said, his voice low, and Nayeli did not need to look to know. "Yes," she answered, just as quietly, and there was something in that answer, not tension, not fear, but readiness, as if whatever came next had already been accepted long before this night began. Ethan shifted again, sitting up slowly this time, the blanket slipping slightly before he pulled it back into place, careful not to break the warmth they had built, and he ran a hand over his face, feeling the roughness there, the years that had passed without anyone close enough to notice. "When the sun comes," he said, more to himself than to her, "this ends." And Nayeli watched him, her eyes steady. "No," she said, "it begins." And he let out a quiet breath at that, because he understood what she meant, understood that whatever waited outside was not about this night alone, but about what came after, about what a man did when the storm was no longer there to hide behind. The cabin felt smaller now, not from the cold, but from the weight of what it held. Two people, one choice, and a past that had found its way back through snow and silence to stand at the door. Ethan rose to his feet then, slow, deliberate, not reaching for his gun, not reaching for anything except the truth he could no longer avoid, and he walked to the door, stopping just short of it, his hand hovering over the handle as he listened one more time, not for the storm, but for the quiet beyond it, behind him. Nayeli remained still, not calling out, not stopping him, because this part was his, always had been, and as Ethan stood there, the wood cold beneath his palm, he realized something he had not allowed himself to admit for years, that the man he had been did not have to be the man he stayed, and outside, in the fading storm, the watchers waited, not for a fight, not for fear, but for the moment when the door would open and show them what kind of man stood inside. The handle felt colder than anything else in the room, like it held the night itself inside the metal, and Ethan's hand hovered there for a moment longer before finally closing around it, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet acceptance that came when a man understood there was no step backward left to take. Behind him, the cabin remained still, the last of the fire reduced to a dull glow, the air thick with the kind of silence that follows a long decision, and he could feel Nayeli's presence without turning, steady, certain, not waiting to stop him, only waiting to see. The wind had softened now, no longer clawing at the walls, but drifting across them like something tired, and in that shift, the world outside felt closer, clearer, as if the storm had done its part and was now stepping aside for what came next. Ethan drew in a slow breath, then pulled the door open. The cold rushed in first, sharp and immediate, carrying with it the scent of snow and distance, but it was not the cold that made him still, it was the sight beyond it. They stood there, just past the edge of the clearing, figures dark against the pale stretch of snow, not hidden, not advancing, simply present, horses steady beneath them, breath rising in quiet clouds, and for a moment, nothing moved, not them, not him, as if the entire valley had paused to witness what would happen next. Ethan stepped forward onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight, his boots sinking slightly into the fresh layer of snow, and he did not reach for his weapon, did not raise his voice. He simply stood, facing them the way a man faces something he cannot outrun. There were many, more than he could count at a glance. But it was not their number that held his attention. It was their stillness, the way they waited without urgency, without threat, like something older than conflict, something that did not need to prove itself. One of them shifted slightly, not stepping forward, just enough to break the perfect stillness, and Ethan's gaze followed the movement, his breath slow and visible in the cold air, his posture steady despite the weight of the moment. Behind him, the door remained open, the warmth of the cabin fading with each second, but he did not look back, not yet, because this part belonged to him. The silence stretched, long enough to feel like a test, and Ethan understood then that no words had been asked for, no explanation demanded, only presence, only truth in its simplest form. He let his shoulders settle, not in surrender, not in defiance, but in something quieter, something harder to name. and he took one more step forward, leaving the shelter of the porch, standing fully in the open where nothing separated him from them. Not wood, not shadow, not the past he had tried to leave behind. The cold pressed against him immediately, but he did not retreat, did not wrap himself tighter. He simply stood there, meeting their watchful silence with one of his own, and for the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not relief, but recognition. As if the man he had been and the man he had tried to become had finally stopped running from each other. Behind him, soft footsteps touched the wooden floor, then the porch, and he knew without turning that Nayeli had come to stand in the doorway, not beside him, not yet, but close enough that her presence could be felt, and the moment held there, balanced between night and morning, between judgment and understanding, waiting for something unseen to tip it forward. For a long moment, nothing changed. The figures in the snow remained still, the horses quiet beneath them, the world holding its breath as if waiting for something that did not come from movement, but from choice. And Ethan stood there in the cold, his coat thin against the wind, his hands empty at his sides, knowing that this silence was not emptiness. It was judgment without words. Behind him, Nayeli stepped fully onto the porch, her presence no longer hidden by the doorway, and though she did not stand beside him, the distance between them no longer felt like separation. It felt like something understood, something already decided. One of the riders shifted again, then slowly, deliberately, lowered his gaze, not in submission, not in weakness, but in acknowledgement, and the others followed, one by one, until the line of watchers no longer stared with question, but with something quieter, something resolved. Ethan did not move at first, did not speak, because he understood that whatever had just passed between them did not need words. It had already been seen, measured, and answered. The cold pressed harder now, seeping through his boots, his coat, his breath turning slow and heavy, but he did not step back, not until the moment had fully settled, not until the silence itself began to ease. Then, as quietly as they had come, the riders shifted their horses, not rushing, not retreating in fear, just turning with the same calm purpose they had carried all night. And within seconds, the storm began to take them again, their shapes fading into the white distance until only the faint rhythm of hooves remained. Then even that was gone, swallowed by the quiet that follows a storm when it has spent everything it has to give. Ethan stood there a moment longer, staring at the empty stretch where they had been, as if trying to understand what had just happened, not outside, but inside himself, and slowly, he exhaled, the breath leaving him like something he had carried for years without knowing it. Behind him, Nayeli stepped down from the porch, her boots pressing softly into the snow, and she moved to stand a few feet away, not close, not distant, her eyes on him, not searching anymore, just seeing. They saw, she said quietly, and Ethan nodded once, because he felt it too, that whatever had been asked of him had been answered without a single word spoken aloud. He turned then, facing her fully for the first time in the pale light of early morning, the storm breaking apart above them, the sky beginning to show through in faint streaks of gray and gold, and for a second, neither spoke, because there was nothing left to explain. "You will go," he said after a moment, not as a question, and she inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she replied, simple, certain, and there was no disappointment in him, no expectation that she would stay, because that had never been the point. She reached up then, touching the amulet at her neck once more, and after a brief pause, she stepped closer, just enough to place it in his hand, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged. Ethan looked down at it, the worn stone, the memory it carried, the weight it held, and for a moment he said nothing, because he understood what it meant now, not as a token, not as a debt, but as something returned when it was no longer needed to prove anything. "You kept it," he said quietly, and she gave the faintest hint of a nod. "Until I knew," she answered, and that was all. The wind moved gently across the clearing, no longer sharp, no longer biting, just passing through, and Ethan closed his fingers around the amulet, feeling its warmth against his palm despite the cold around him. When he looked up again, Nayeli had already turned, her steps light but certain as she walked away from the cabin, not looking back, not needing to, because whatever had brought her here had been fulfilled. Ethan remained where he was, the snow stretching out before him, the silence settling into something new, something that did not feel empty. And as the first light of morning touched the land, he realized that for the first time in years, the quiet around him did not feel like something he was hiding inside. It felt like something he had chosen to stand within. And out here, where words carried less weight than actions, that was the only kind of answer that ever mattered. They said a man knows what he's hunting the moment he leaves his door, but Ethan Cole would later swear he had no idea that morning would bring him something alive, something watching him back, something that would change the way he understood silence. The snow was already knee-deep by the time he reached the ridge, his boots dragging through powder that swallowed sound and made the whole valley feel like it was holding its breath, the kind of cold that bit through wool and settled into bone. And all he wanted was enough meat to last the week. Something simple, something clean, nothing complicated, nothing human. But then he saw her, not at first as a person, just a shape against the drift near the frozen creek, dark against white, too still to be an animal, too deliberate to be an accident. And when he stepped closer, rifle low but ready, she moved, just enough to prove she wasn't part of the landscape, her hand tightening around something small and silver, her eyes opening with a sharpness that didn't belong to someone half buried in snow. And that was the moment everything shifted. He should have turned back. Any man out here knew the stories, knew what it meant to find an Apache woman alone in winter, knew what kind of trouble followed footprints like that. But she wasn't reaching for a weapon. She wasn't even trying to stand. She was watching him like she was measuring something deeper than distance. And when he finally crouched beside her, the cold biting through his gloves, she grabbed his wrist with a strength that didn't match her condition and whispered, "If you rush, you won't live till sunrise." Her voice low, steady, like it wasn't a warning but a memory, and Ethan froze, not because of the words, but because of the way she said them, like she had already seen what would happen next. He followed her gaze without meaning to, up toward the ridge behind him, where the wind carved lines into the snow. And there they were, 5 riders, still as fence posts, watching, not moving, not calling out, just there, close enough to be seen, far enough to make distance feel like a lie. And something about that silence weighed heavier than any threat he'd ever known. He didn't raise his rifle, didn't call out, just stayed there with her hand still locked around his wrist, feeling the faint tremor in her grip, the kind that didn't come from fear, but from holding something back. And after a long moment, longer than it should have been, he made a choice he couldn't explain even years later. He lowered the rifle completely and slid his arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her from the snow despite every instinct telling him to leave, to walk away, to pretend. He never saw her, but he didn't rush, not after what she said, not after the way those riders didn't move. And as he carried her down toward his cabin, each step slow, measured, the cold air cutting through the valley like a blade, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't bringing something home. He was bringing something into his life that had already begun long before he ever stepped into that snow. The cabin door shut against the wind with a dull, final sound, and for a moment the world outside disappeared as if it had never existed. But Ethan Cole knew better, because silence like that did not come from peace. It came from something waiting. He laid her down near the fire, careful not to move too fast, careful not to forget her words, and she did not thank him, did not even look at him the way most people would after being pulled from the cold. Instead, her eyes moved around the room, counting, measuring, noting every detail from the rifle above the door to the single chair by the window, as if she was deciding whether this place could keep her alive or not. The fire cracked low, casting long shadows across the wooden walls, and when he reached for a kettle to warm water, she shifted just enough to remind him she was still watching, her hand tightening again around that small silver ring, the metal catching the light in a way that felt out of place in a cabin built for survival, not secrets. "You should not have brought me here," she said after a long stretch of quiet, her voice steady now, stronger than it had been in the snow. And Ethan paused, not because of the words, but because of the certainty behind them, like she was stating a fact instead of offering a warning. "Leaving you out there was not an option," he replied, his tone even, though his eyes drifted toward the window where the faint outline of the ridge could still be seen through frost and gathering dusk. She followed his gaze without turning her head, and for the first time, there was something different in her expression, not fear, not relief, something closer to patience. They will not come yet, she said quietly, almost to herself, and Ethan felt that same weight settle into the room again, the kind that made time stretch longer than it should. He moved slowly, setting the kettle near the fire, keeping his hands visible, not out of fear of her, but out of respect for something he did not fully understand. And when he offered the cup once it was warm, she did not take it right away, her eyes flicking to his hands, then back to his face, as if measuring intent instead of action. "You move like a man who has learned to wait," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only observation, and Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Out here, rushing gets you killed," he answered, and for the briefest moment, something like agreement passed through her gaze before it disappeared again. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a sound that was not quite movement, not quite silence, something in between, and Ethan stepped closer to the window, wiping a small patch of frost with the back of his hand, just enough to see beyond the glass, and what he saw made his jaw tighten without a word. The 5 riders were still there, exactly where they had been before, but now there were more shapes further back, faint outlines blending into the falling snow, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to ignore, and none of them moved. Behind him, the woman spoke again, her voice low, controlled. "They are waiting to see what kind of man you are." And Ethan did not turn, did not ask how she knew, because out on that ridge, under a sky that was already losing its light, he had the feeling the answer was already being decided without him. The fire burned lower as night settled in, not with a rush, but with a quiet certainty that made every sound feel deliberate, and Ethan Cole stood by the window longer than he needed to, watching shapes that did not move, shadows that held their ground like they belonged to the land more than he ever would, and behind him, the woman shifted slightly on the bed, not from weakness but from control, like every movement was chosen, not given. He turned back slowly, his boots soft against the wooden floor, and found her sitting up now, the blanket pulled around her shoulders, the silver ring still resting in her palm as if it carried more weight than the rifle hanging by the door. "You are not afraid," he said, not as a question but as a realization, and her eyes lifted to meet his, calm, steady, reflecting firelight in a way that made it hard to read anything beneath the surface. "Fear is for those who do not understand what is coming," she replied, her voice low but clear, and Ethan felt something shift again, not outside this time, but inside the room, like the space between them had changed. Without either of them moving, he reached for a piece of wood and fed the fire, watching the flames catch slowly, deliberately, and the light pushed back the shadows just enough to reveal the lines of her face more clearly, the quiet strength there, the kind that did not come from surviving one storm but many. "Then help me understand," he said, keeping his tone even, not pressing, not rushing, and she studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he had earned the truth or not. Outside, the wind carried a faint shift, a sound like snow being disturbed far beyond the cabin, and neither of them turned to look this time, as if both already knew what was there. "The man you saw in the snow," she began, her fingers tightening slightly around the ring. He was not alone, and Ethan nodded once, because he had already guessed as much. Nothing out there ever traveled alone, not in winter, not in silence like that. She lifted the ring just enough for the firelight to catch the markings etched into its surface, symbols that meant nothing to him but clearly meant everything to her, "is why they are here." And he stepped closer, not reaching for it, not breaking the distance she had drawn between them, but close enough to see that the metal was worn in places, like it had been carried for a long time, passed through hands that understood its value. "Looks like a piece of silver," he said, and she almost smiled, not in amusement, but in recognition of how little he could see. "It is not what it is made of," she said quietly. "It is what it means," and for the first time, there was something like weight in her voice, something heavier than warning. Ethan leaned back, slightly, crossing his arms not out of defense but out of thought, and glanced once more toward the window, where the darkness had deepened and the shapes beyond it felt closer without moving an inch. "And what does it mean to them?" he asked, and she held his gaze without hesitation. "It means the wrong man is still alive," she answered, and the room fell still again, not with confusion, but with understanding that came too slowly to stop what was already unfolding, because outside, under a sky that had turned black without stars, the waiting had not ended. It had only just begun. The words stayed in the air longer than they should have, settling into the wood, into the firelight, into the quiet space between them, and Ethan Cole did not move right away because some truths did not need a quick answer. They needed time to land. He looked at the ring again, at the way her fingers never fully released it, and something about that told him more than her words ever could. Because people did not hold on to things like that unless letting go meant losing more than metal. Then, "Why bring it here?" he asked after a moment, his voice calm but steady, not accusing, not afraid, just trying to place himself inside a story that had already begun without him. And she tilted her head slightly, studying him again like she had in the snow, like she was measuring whether he was worth the next piece of truth. "I did not bring it here," she said quietly. "You did." And that answer sat heavier than he expected, because it shifted the weight of the night from her to him without raising her voice or changing her expression. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, not loud, but persistent, like something testing the strength of the structure rather than trying to break it, and Ethan glanced toward the door this time, not the window, because doors were where choices were made, where lines were drawn. "Those men out there," he said slowly. "They are not just watching." And she gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like he had finally caught up to something she had known from the start. "They are waiting for you to decide," she replied, and that was the first time her words felt directed at him instead of the situation, like he was no longer just the man who carried her in, but part of the reason those riders had not moved. He let that settle, feeling the quiet weight of responsibility press against him in a way he had not felt in years, not since before he chose this life, before he chose distance over people. The fire shifted again, a log settling deeper into the coals, sending a brief shower of sparks upward that faded just as quickly. And in that flicker of light, he noticed something he had missed before, a faint line along the edge of the ring, markings too precise to be decoration, too deliberate to be random, and without thinking, he stepped closer, stopping just short of reaching distance. "That is not a trinket," he said, more to himself than to her. And this time, she did smile, faint and brief, like a shadow passing across her face. "No," she said. "It is a promise." And Ethan exhaled slowly, because promises out here were not made lightly, and they were not broken without consequence. "Then someone already broke it," he said, and her eyes held his for a second longer than before. Something unspoken passing between them. Not trust. Not yet, but recognition. Outside, the faint shapes beyond the cabin shifted just enough to be noticed. Not closer, not farther, but different, like the line between waiting and acting was starting to blur. And Ethan felt it in his chest before he saw it with his eyes. He moved to the rifle by the door, not grabbing it, not lifting it, just resting his hand against the wood beside it, grounding himself in something familiar, something simple, and behind him, her voice came. Again, softer now, but no less certain. "If you pick that up too soon," she said, "you become the man they expect." And Ethan stood there, his hand still against the wall, feeling the weight of that choice settle into place. Because out there, beyond the frost and the darkness, they were not waiting for a fight. They were waiting for him to prove which side of the silence he belonged to. The room held its breath again after her words, and Ethan Cole slowly pulled his hand away from the wall beside the rifle, not out of hesitation but out of choice, a quiet decision that settled deeper than any sudden move ever could. And for the first time since he carried her through the snow, the space between them felt less like distance and more like understanding. He stepped back toward the fire, lowering himself into the chair without breaking eye contact, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight as the flames cast shifting light across his face and across hers, revealing not fear, not urgency, but a kind of patience that made time itself feel slower inside that cabin. "Then I will not rush," he said finally. The words simple, but they carried weight, because out here, a man's pace was the only thing he truly controlled, and she watched him for a long moment before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, like something inside her had adjusted, just slightly. The wind outside shifted again, brushing against the cabin with a low, steady pressure, and Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze drifting not to the window this time, but to the floor between them, where the firelight flickered and faded, like it was marking time in a way neither of them could ignore. "You said the wrong man is still alive," he said, not looking up yet, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "So who do they think that man is?" And the question lingered in the air, not sharp, not demanding, just present. And when he finally lifted his eyes, she was already watching him, as if she had been waiting for that exact question. "That depends," she said softly, turning the ring slowly between her fingers, the silver catching the firelight in small, deliberate flashes, "on what you choose to become before morning." And Ethan felt that again, that shift, subtle but undeniable, like the ground beneath a man's feet changing without warning. And he let out a slow breath, because the answer was not out there in the snow. It was here, in the room, in the quiet decisions that no one else would ever see. He stood then, not quickly, not with tension, just rising to his feet with the same measured pace he had carried since the moment she spoke those first words on the ridge. And he moved to the small table near the fire, where a piece of cloth and a tin of salve sat untouched, things meant for simple wounds, simple days. And he picked them up without looking at her. "Your shoulder," he said, glancing briefly at the place where the snow had clung too long, where the cold had pressed deeper than it should have. "It will not wait until sunrise." And for a second, there was hesitation in her posture, not fear, not resistance, something quieter, something more human. And then she shifted the blanket aside just enough, not offering trust, but allowing it to exist. Ethan stepped closer, slow enough that every movement could be seen, understood, nothing hidden, nothing rushed. And as he worked, careful, deliberate, the kind of care that came from years of doing things alone, without witnesses, without praise, the silence between them changed again, not heavy now, not waiting, just there, like the fire, like the wind, like something that did not need to be named. Outside, the shapes on the ridge did not move, but something about them felt different, not closer, not farther, just aware, like they too could sense that something inside the cabin had shifted, something that would decide more than just the night. And when he finished, stepping back without a word, without asking for anything in return, she looked at him in a way she had not before, not measuring, not testing, but seeing. And after a moment, she closed her hand around the ring again and said quietly, "You are not the man they were expecting." And Ethan did not answer, because out there, beyond the walls, beneath a sky that held no stars, he had the feeling that what he had chosen not to do might matter more than anything he ever could. The fire had settled into a steady glow, low and constant, the kind that no longer fought the cold but simply held its ground against it. And Ethan Cole stood near the window again, not to watch for movement, but to listen for it, because out here, sound always came before sight, and silence always meant something had already been decided. Behind him, she shifted slightly, her breathing even now, controlled, not like someone recovering, but like someone conserving strength for something that had not yet arrived. And when he turned, she was watching him again, not with suspicion this time, not entirely, but with something quieter, something that did not need to be named. "You keep looking out there," she said, her voice calm, almost curious, "but they are not looking for a way in." And Ethan leaned one shoulder against the wall beside the window, his arms loose at his sides, his gaze still fixed on the dark shapes beyond the frost. "Then what are they waiting for?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would not be simple. She did not reply right away, and in that pause, the wind moved across the valley in a long, slow breath, brushing the cabin with a sound that felt less like pressure and more like presence. "They are waiting for truth," she said at last, and Ethan let that settle, because truth out here had a way of arriving without warning and leaving just as quietly. He stepped away from the window then, moving back toward the fire, where the warmth had deepened, filling the room with that familiar scent of wood and smoke, something steady, something grounded. And he stopped a few feet from her, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to retreat. You said that ring is a promise, he said, his voice even, measured. So whose promise is it? And she looked down at it again, her fingers tracing the edge with a familiarity that spoke of more than ownership. It spoke of memory. It was made for peace, she said softly, not between strangers, but between those who chose not to be enemies. And Ethan nodded once, because that sounded like the kind of thing men believed. And before they learned better, before the land taught them otherwise. And now, he said, his eyes lifting back to hers, it is bringing men to my door. And there was no anger in his voice, only observation, only the weight of cause and effect laid bare without judgment. She met his gaze without hesitation, and for the first time, there was something else there, something close to regret, but not for herself. Because someone decided it no longer mattered, she said, and the words carried a quiet finality that made the room feel smaller, like the walls had drawn in just enough to remind them both that what was happening out there could not be left outside forever. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he turned slightly, his eyes drifting toward the door again, because doors were still where choices waited. And what happens if I hand it back? He asked, not looking at her this time, but at the worn wood, at the line where it met the floor, where snow had once been tracked in and melted away without a trace. She was quiet for a moment, longer than before, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, not weaker, just more honest. Then you become part of something you do not understand, she said, and you lose the chance to decide what kind of man you are before they decide for you. And Ethan closed his eyes briefly, just a second, just long enough to feel the weight of that settle into him. Because out there, beyond the ridge, beyond the silence, there were men who had already made up their minds. And in here, inside this small cabin holding back the night, there was still a moment left to choose something different, something that did not belong to them, something that might not even belong to him yet. And when he opened his eyes again, the firelight caught them just right, steady, clear, and the silence between them no longer felt like waiting. It felt like the edge of something that would not stay still much longer. The night deepened without warning, not darker in a way the eye could measure, but heavier, like the air itself had decided to settle closer to the ground, and Ethan Cole felt it before he saw it, a shift in the silence that no longer felt patient, no longer felt still, but ready. He moved back toward the window, slower than before, not because he was unsure, but because he had learned that speed did not change what waited beyond the glass. And when he cleared the frost again with the side of his hand, the ridge answered him differently this time. The shapes no longer fixed in place but spread wider, not closer, not retreating, just forming something that did not need to be explained to be understood. Behind him, she did not ask what he saw, and that told him she already knew. They have decided, she said quietly, and her voice carried no fear, only recognition, like a moment she had been counting toward had finally arrived. Ethan did not turn right away, his eyes tracing the line of riders now stretched across the ridge, no longer five, no longer scattered, but arranged with a purpose that pressed against the edges of the cabin without touching it. And for the first time that night, he noticed something else, not movement, not sound, but stillness between them, a kind of restraint that felt more deliberate than any action. They are not coming in, he said, more to himself than to her. And when he stepped back from the window, the firelight caught the edge of his face, steady, grounded, unchanged in a way that surprised even him. She watched him carefully, her fingers still wrapped around the ring, but not as tightly as before, as if something inside her had eased without her allowing it to. They will not cross that line, she replied, and Ethan glanced toward the door again, then to the floor, then back to her, because the line she spoke of was not drawn in snow, not marked by fences or walls, but by something quieter, something that lived in decisions rather than distance. Because of you, he said, and she shook her head once, slow, deliberate. Because of you, she corrected, and that settled differently, deeper, like a truth that did not belong to either of them alone. The fire shifted again, casting long shadows that moved across the walls like silent witnesses, and Ethan stepped closer to the center of the room, no longer keeping distance, no longer measuring every inch between them, because whatever this had become, it was no longer just hers to carry. If they believe I am the wrong man, he said, his voice calm but firm. Then they are waiting for me to prove them right. And she held his gaze, searching, not for doubt, but for something steadier, something harder to find. Or prove them wrong, she said, and for the first time, there was something in her voice that had not been there before. Not patience, not caution, something closer to hope, but quieter, like it did not trust itself to exist yet. Outside, one of the riders shifted slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to be seen. And that small movement carried more weight than any charge ever could, because it meant the waiting had reached its edge. Ethan felt it settle into him, not as pressure, but as clarity, and without another word, he turned toward the door, his steps measured, his hands empty, and when he reached it, he paused just long enough to feel the warmth of the cabin. Behind him, the fire, the stillness, the presence of someone who had changed the shape of this night without raising her voice. Behind him, she spoke once more, softer than before, but steady. If you step outside, you cannot take it back. And Ethan rested his hand against the wood, feeling the cold seeping through from the other side. And for a moment, just a moment, the world narrowed to that single choice. That single line between what he had been and what he was about to become. And then, without rushing, without hesitation, he began to open the door. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, and the cold rushed in like it had been waiting just on the other side. Not violent, not sudden, but certain, wrapping around Ethan Cole as he stepped out onto the worn wooden porch, his boots settling against the frost with a soft, final sound. And for a moment, he did not move, did not reach, did not speak, because out there, across the white stretch of land, the men on the ridge were no longer shapes. They were watching him the same way he had watched them, measuring, waiting, deciding. The wind carried nothing but distance, no voices, no commands, just the quiet weight of presence. And Ethan stood with his hands empty at his sides, the rifle still inside. The door left slightly open behind him, letting a thin line of firelight stretch into the night like something fragile but unbroken. One rider moved first, not forward, not in challenge, just a shift of posture that drew attention without demanding it. And from that small motion, another followed, and then another, until the line of them seemed less like a barrier and more like a question laid across the ridge. Ethan took a single step forward, not closing the distance, just acknowledging it, his breath visible in the cold air, steady, controlled, and he did not raise his voice when he spoke, because out here, men who needed to shout were rarely the ones being listened to. She is inside, he said, simple, direct, the words carrying just enough to reach them without breaking the stillness that held everything together. And for a moment, nothing answered, not movement, not sound, just the kind of silence that did not reject, but did not accept either. Then one rider eased forward, just enough to separate from the others, his presence distinct without being isolated. And though the distance kept his face in shadow, there was something in the way he held himself that spoke of authority, not through force, but through certainty. Ethan did not move closer, did not step back. He held his ground the same way they held theirs. And the space between them became something more than distance. It became the line she had spoken of, unseen but understood. Behind him, the door shifted slightly in the wind, and he knew she was there without turning, without looking, because some presences did not need to be seen to be felt. The rider lifted one hand, not in threat, not in greeting, just enough to signal that this moment had meaning. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the cold air, low, controlled, every word measured. You brought something that does not belong to you. And Ethan let the words settle before answering, not out of defiance, but out of respect for what was being asked beneath them. I brought someone who was left in the snow, he replied, his voice just as steady, just as calm, and, for a brief moment, the wind seemed to pause, as if the land itself was listening. The rider did not respond immediately, and in that silence, the others remained still, not pressing forward, not retreating, holding their place as if bound to something deeper than orders. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not in discomfort, but in readiness, not for conflict, but for whatever came next. And then, from behind him, a voice cut through the space between them, not loud, not forced, but clear, enough to reach every ear on that ridge. He did not take anything. she said, stepping into the doorway, the firelight framing her against the dark, the silver ring catching just enough glow to be seen even from a distance. And Ethan did not turn to look at her, because he knew that this moment no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to what she would choose to reveal. And out there, the rider's posture shifted again, not forward, not back, but different, as if something unseen had just changed, and the line between them, that quiet, invisible line, began to move. The moment her voice reached the ridge, the night changed in a way no man could measure, not louder, not softer, but clearer, as if something unseen had finally stepped into the light, and Ethan Cole felt it in the stillness around him, in the way the wind no longer pressed against his back, but moved past him, carrying her words into the space between him and the riders. He did not turn, did not look at her, because this was no longer about what he had done, it was about what she was choosing to reveal. And out there, the man who had stepped forward held his position, his silhouette steady against the pale stretch of snow, his gaze fixed not on Ethan, but on the woman standing in the doorway. The firelight behind her cast a faint glow across her figure, enough to make the silver ring visible in her hand, enough to mark her not as something taken, but as someone who had stepped forward by her own will. And that distinction settled into the air like a quiet truth no one could ignore. For a long moment, no one spoke, and that silence was not empty. It was full, filled with understanding that did not need to be explained. And then the man on the ridge lowered his hand slowly, not in surrender, not in defeat, but in recognition, and the line of riders behind him shifted, not breaking formation, not advancing, just easing in a way that told its own story. Ethan let out a breath he had been holding without knowing it, not in relief, but in acceptance, because whatever had been decided out here, it had not been decided by him alone. Behind him, she stepped one pace forward, the boards beneath her feet, soft with frost, and her voice came again, steady, certain, carrying across the open ground without force. "The promise still stands," she said, and this time, the words felt different, not like a warning, not like a memory, but like something being placed back where it belonged. The man on the ridge inclined his head just slightly, the smallest gesture, but one that carried weight far beyond its size. And then, without another word, he turned his horse, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the same measured control that had defined every movement of the night. And one by one, the others followed, their forms fading into the darkness the same way they had appeared, leaving no sound but the soft rhythm of hooves against snow that did not echo, did not linger. Ethan stood where he was, watching until the last shape disappeared beyond the ridge, until the night returned to something closer to what it had been before, though not the same. Never the same. The cold pressed in again, but it no longer felt like a threat, just a presence, something that existed without asking for anything in return. And slowly, he turned back toward the cabin, toward the open door where the light still spilled out in a narrow line. She had not moved far, still standing just inside, the ring now resting loosely in her hand, not gripped, not hidden. And when their eyes met, there was no need for words, no need to explain what had passed between them, because some things did not belong to language. They belonged to choices, to moments that could not be taken back once made. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality, and the fire welcomed him again, steady, unchanged, but he knew he was not the same man who had left it. She crossed the room slowly, placing the silver ring on the table between them, not offering it, not asking for anything, just leaving it there like a question that no longer needed an answer. And then she looked at him, not as someone measuring, not as someone testing, but as someone who had already decided something for herself. "You did not rush," she said softly, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Something warmer, quieter, something that did not belong to the cold outside. And Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze dropping briefly to the ring before lifting back to her. He did not reach for it, did not move closer, because some distances were not meant to be closed all at once. And in that stillness, with the fire crackling low and the wind fading beyond the walls, he understood something he had not known when the day began, that not everything brought home was meant to be kept, and not everything left behind was truly gone. And as the night settled into silence once more, deeper now, steadier, the kind that came after something had been decided without a single shot fired. Ethan Cole stood there, knowing that whatever this had been, it was not an ending, just the quiet beginning of something he would not rush, not anymore.